morning. Glad that you're all with us. Good time to be together. We're thankful for the opportunity we have and hope that we'll all benefit from our study this morning. We're starting in Mark 15 in about verse 40. We'll back up a little bit in a moment to remind ourselves of where we were, but picking up mainly in Mark 15 around verse 40. Again, we're glad that you are all with us and privileged to have this opportunity for worship. We'll bow together and pray before we start our study. Holy Father, we're thankful as we come into your presence today. We're grateful for all those who are here with us, for the chance we have to build each other up and to unite our voices and join our hearts in praise of you who are so deserving of it. We pray as we look together at your word today that we would gain from it, that we would be strengthened and emboldened, that we would be impressed as we should with what your Son did on our behalf, that he was willing to suffer all things and to die though he was innocent so that we can be saved. We're grateful for his life, for his teaching, his example, his courage, and his love for us. We pray that we'd always live in view of his sacrifice. Be with us today as we study and as we worship, as we live our lives before you and with each other. Help us to be like you and like him. We offer our prayer this morning in faith and in love for you. In Christ's name, amen. Well, we finished up last week in Mark 15 with really the climax, in many ways, the high point of Mark's entire gospel. He's been asking this question and depicting people asking this question over and over again. Who is Jesus? Who is he? What is he? This question of identity has been hanging over the previous 15 chapters, and we've seen some answers to it. We've seen bad answers to it. We've seen half answers to it. We've seen men come as close as they'd be able to at the time to giving a proper answer. But finally, even though men had been asking amiss, had been asking in bad faith, or had been asking sarcastically, they want to see a sign, and we've seen that happen in Mark's gospel before, of course. People sort of sarcastically asking for a sign, or wickedly, just trying to find something to hang Jesus with. But there have been all this clamoring for a sign, and we've seen Jesus speaking of himself and revealing himself for who he is, and that's been met with more hostility and more antipathy and more derision. And yet now, at the moment of his death, the moment when he would seem defeated, when all things would seem to be most absurd to give him any credit for anything, it's at that moment, with that being the only sign you could speak of at that time, we meet in verse 39 the most complete and most surprising yet testimonial to who he is, the best answer to the question yet that has been offered. Who is he? Who is Jesus? What manner of being is he? What is this? And now it's the centurion at the foot of the cross who answers for all of us, truly this man was the Son of God. We spent a little bit of time last week maybe further developing his statement and maybe answering some questions, hopefully, I guess, answering some questions about what did he really have in mind, or how much would he really have understood. Some of those are unanswerable. We don't know this man. We don't know anything about him after the fact other than tradition and legend to give us any insight into his character or what he truly believed or came to believe. But at least we can speak, or I will attempt to speak for Mark and what his purpose seems to be in his gospel. He does seem to be setting this up as the language of faith, as a confession, as him stating the truth about who Jesus is and believing that to be the case, that this man was the Son of God. All the lead up to that point is showing us, is kind of pushing us in that direction, that we're meant to understand this as kind of the crowning achievement, which again is ultimately proving what Jesus has come to do. Men don't make this confession after they see him raise someone else from the dead. They don't make this confession after they see him feeding people with a boy's lunch. They don't make this confession after they see him cast a demon out. They don't make this confession after they see him do any of the other things that he did. It is when the centurion sees how he died. It is when he sees what Jesus came to do that finally that sort of veil of ignorance or disbelief or misunderstanding is lifted, and a man is finally able to grasp, finally able to come to terms with. This was the Son of God. That casts his death, it casts this whole scene in chapters 14 and 15 in a very important light then, which we understand, but helpful for the initial readers of the gospel or the initial readers and hearers of this story to understand that this is not defeat, this is not a typical death, this is not what one would typically, the impression or the feeling that one would typically get during a crucifixion, which is of abject humiliation, crushing defeat, the worst possible outcome. Instead, we are seeing it as the accomplishment, the completion of the task for which Jesus has come. He has come and done all the things that he has done and said all the things that he said so that people will believe who he is, will understand and believe and confess before men who he is. And there in verse 39, the most unlikely of sources will do just that. The man in charge of his execution, in many ways, is going to be the first to grasp or to vocalize what has actually happened, that this was in fact the Son of God. Anything to mention? As I said, we got to that kind of towards the end of class last week. So any follow-up questions, thoughts on anything that we've seen up through about verse 39 there in Mark 15? No takers. All right, beginning in verse 40 then. After this, again, in many ways, climax, we're going to start building towards what ultimately is maybe the crowning achievement of everything depicted in Mark. We're going to see the build-up to the resurrection itself. So in verse 40, he starts showing this group of women who will come up several times throughout the rest of the gospel, especially in the early parts of chapter 16 and the rest of this chapter. Another one of Mark's sort of sandwich accounts, which we're no strangers to those by now. So he's going to start by telling us about the women who see Jesus dying and ultimately being taken down from the cross and buried. And he'll get back to the women in verse 47 and then the beginning of chapter 16. He'll have a story of Joseph actually burying Jesus in the middle of that. But he first introduces us to these women in verse 40 who were looking on from afar. You have, in this group mentioned here, and it maybe differs a little bit in the gospel accounts, or maybe is depicting the same group of women. It's difficult to say. You get frustrated with these first century Palestinian Jews for naming every little girl Mary and every little boy John or James or something like that. How many of these guys do we meet? But there are a lot of Marys that you encounter in the New Testament, and so it can be difficult to parse through exactly who is who, how many different women are being depicted here. But he names three in verse 40. Mary Magdalene, who is always heading the list in the resurrection accounts especially. She'll factor into that prominently, even here in Mark. You have Mary, the mother of James the Less and of Joseph. Some people apply this to Jesus' mother. He had brothers, and one of them, at least, by one of those names given. It does not seem to be Mary, the mother of Jesus, in mind there. That would seem to be the much easier way of referring to her in a way that we would know. And James the Less goes in very well with one of the apostles named James the Less, James the son of Alphaeus. So we assume that to be his mother, who also was named Mary. And then Salome, we understand to be the mother of James and John, the two apostles, sons of Zebedee. Again, they're called by different names in different gospels, or maybe you have a larger group of women and each writer focuses in on a few. I guess parse through that on your own and draw your own conclusions. Mark is telling us about a group of three women who have been with Jesus for a long time. That's the main takeaway that he wants us to have from this. They've come from Galilee and have been by his side during so many different things that have happened. And here they are, after having followed him and ministered to him throughout probably the entire time that's in mind. Now here they are still at the cross itself. But I do want to mention, and I don't want any of this to, I guess, take away from our esteem of these women, but Mark does show them in at least a realistic light, and maybe kind of a mixed portrayal overall. For one, the idea there in verse 40 is that they're looking on from afar, which is the same way the apostles have been portrayed in the lead up to this. And we have to remember that the theme that we saw back in chapter 14 was of everyone, all people, deserting Jesus and him not having anyone there to stand with him at the end. Now, obviously, these women just, I guess because of their role, their proximity to him, their social position, they wouldn't be called upon to do the kinds of things the disciples were called upon. You wouldn't expect of them the proximity to Jesus at the end that you might have of someone like Peter, who's swinging swords and saying, "I'll die with you." There is a difference. But they're afar off, and they're merely looking on. Maybe there's a correlation between the language of the end of chapter 13, where Jesus has told his disciples they're to be watchful, but Mark uses a different word for watching or for looking here. In fact, the word he uses here is oftentimes used of someone who is showing timidity or who is wanting to just kind of observe in a detached way from afar. And that's the language he uses here to portray these women who are looking on. They're associated with him. They've identified with him fully throughout these last several years. But here in the end, just like all others, they are removed. They're detached a little bit from the proceedings. They're a ways back. When we get to chapter 16 and see the resurrection account, in verses 6 through 8, for instance, they are told, don't be afraid, don't be alarmed, and go and tell the disciples where Jesus is going and what we're saying to you. And then in verse 8, it says they left and they were terrified and they didn't tell anyone what happened. And so you were told, do two things, and you didn't do either one of them. So again, the portrayal is not perfect. It's not unrealistic. We are typically impressed with their devotion to Jesus that they display throughout this account. And I would highlight that. But he's, as we've seen with depictions of disciples, Mark isn't trying to sanitize things. He's not trying to paint anyone to be something that they were not, or trying to hide warts or flaws. And maybe we see some of the beginning of that there in verse 40, with just this little bit of removal, this little bit of distance that we see from the women who have been nearby. But they see what has happened, and they will see some other things at the end of this chapter that primarily help them serve as witnesses to what is about to take place. And maybe that's why Mark mentions so many names, so many proper names, actual people one could speak to, and leaves us with that bit of evidence as well. Brother Forrest.
Right here at that part, it says they were afraid. That's probably why they were standing off at the crucifixion.
Sure.
Because they were afraid that if they were recognized, they might accidentally be killed themselves.
Yeah, there are plenty of things to be afraid of in this entire scene. This entire weekend is filled with a lot of ways you could get yourself caught in something.
And one thing that the centurion said that has always bothered me every time I read it, he said, "This was the Son of God." That's past tense.
Yeah.
And to me, every time I read it, this is the Son of God.
Sure.
And so that was just me. So it doesn't change the meaning a lot, but it does change the idea that he's still present.
Yeah. To give a full accounting of who this is. Yeah. So these three women that we meet here in verse 40, By the way, verse 41, again, to give them their propers, they've followed and ministered to Jesus. No one else is spoken of in Mark except for angels in chapter 1. Those are the only people who minister to Jesus. Those are the only people depicted as being in that kind of direct service role to Jesus, to the King of the Jews, the Son of God. And you have 3 humans who are said of them that they ministered to him. Again, I'm sure many others did, and we see acts of love and of worship and appreciation, but these 2 Marys and Salome are the ones specifically who ministered to Jesus at various points in time. Something very much to be said on their behalf. But we then are introduced to Joseph, well, ultimately in verse 43. So the scene shifts a little bit in verse 42. Evening has come, and Mark tells us that it's preparation day, so time becomes a concern. He informs his largely Gentile, probably Roman readers that by preparation day, what I mean is that it's the day before the Sabbath, that it is Friday, that all of this has happened. And it is, to the Jews, a scandalous thing to have someone left exposed this way overnight. Even someone who has an enemy, a blasphemer, someone who has rightly deserved death and has been executed, and this is according to the law, who has maybe been stoned to death because of a crime that they've committed, and they're being displayed publicly. Even that person, you take them down. You don't leave them over the Sabbath, definitely, but really you ought not leave them for sundown even. But this would be anathema to the Jews. And so probably, we can't surmise too much, but probably just the enormity of the disrespect and the curse it would be to someone to leave them displayed in such a way, probably even among those who were shouting, "Crucify," and who were ready to see Jesus killed. You probably have a lot of people even among that group saying, yes, it's time for him to come down. It's time, let them bury him. Let them do whatever they need to do. Again, I don't know how far that would have gone with some of his most hostile enemies, but it would be important to many people that Jesus is to be taken down as soon as possible after he has expired. So Joseph comes onto the scene, and he's an interesting dichotomy, kind of, that mirrors the centurion, because he too is a commendable, maybe the lone commendable member of an otherwise enemy group. The centurion who has just said, truly, this is the Son of God, he's the last source you would expect something like that from, because he works with the enemy. He works for Rome. He carries out Pilate's orders. He's just crucified Jesus. Well, Joseph of Arimathea is described to us as a prominent council member. The council he's talking about is the Jewish council, is the Sanhedrin, is the same body that has just said, he's deserving of death, take him to Pilate and get him crucified. They're the ones responsible for this. Joseph is a member of that group. I don't know if he was present at those meetings earlier. Again, we know nothing else about any of those interactions that might have been had. We just know he's a part of that group who has been the enemy. They've been the bad guy, the antagonist, throughout this entire lead up, starting in chapter 14, and well, really all throughout Mark's gospel. So Joseph is unknown to us elsewhere in Mark, and really outside of the Gospels in these burial accounts. We don't know anything about him. There are a lot of legends and traditions about him. Our picture is kind of colored by what John and Matthew tell us, that he was a disciple in secret, that maybe had been for a little while someone who followed Jesus. Mark doesn't really use that language. He says that he was waiting for the kingdom of God. That's probably meant to imply that he is a disciple, that he is a follower of Jesus, but it's not as bold or clear the language that Matthew and John, for instance, would use. But we know a few more things about him that Mark colors in for our understanding here. First of all, he says he's a prominent council member, which is telling us a little bit about his character. It does mean that he has influence or that he has power. We think of someone being prominent, meaning they're well known, they're well respected, they have kind of a high position in whatever group you're talking about. But it also functions as a way of saying that he's reputable, that he's honorable. He's a prominent council member, not just that he has tenure or something like that, but that people think highly of him. He has a name among them. He has a good reputation among that group. So there is some integrity or some character that's spoken of there. He is, as we just mentioned a moment ago, waiting for the kingdom of God. He's someone who has spiritual things in mind. He wants to see God's plan unfold, and now has found that, of course. We get a sense in verse 43 for the fact that if there has been cowardice on his account before, where he's been this kind of secret disciple, that's surely evaporating in verse 43, because here he is going to Pilate, asking for the body of someone who has just been crucified as an enemy of the state, as a rabble-rouser. He's got every camp in Jerusalem, seemingly, except for some of the common people, seem to have wanted Jesus dead. And now here is Joseph willing to maybe take on that identification himself and being the one who would ask for the body. It makes it a very similar act to what we saw back in chapter 14. And we'll see a little bit of interplay with the account in chapter 14 throughout this whole burial sequence. You remember the woman in Bethany, beginning in verse 3, whoever we assume her to be. She goes unnamed in Mark's gospel, but this woman who anointed Jesus, Jesus says she has done this for my burial, that she had prefigured what was going to happen, that she had anointed him for his burial and had done a good thing and was not sparing with his praise of her. He says, anywhere the gospel is preached, people should mention this as well, that she has done this great thing. She has done what she could and just sort of heaped praise upon her for having done that. And all the things that we said of that really apply in some fashion to what Joseph is doing. The kind of the cost, not in a monetary sense here, but to an extent taking on a financial cost to bury Jesus. The willingness to do something that would maybe scandalize others, that people of your own group are going to look at and criticize or feel badly about. There's just a lot of boldness in this act, and it is showing respect for Jesus at the moment and beyond the moment of his death, which her act did as well. It's a type of disciple behavior. She was the great follower of Jesus back there in chapter 14, who really did what the disciples were all being called upon to do. Well, he's kind of following in those footsteps now. We're starting to see people really have it really click for them. He is also going to show a bit of, personal interest in what happens and some extravagance. Going an extra mile. He, in verse 46, brings fine linen to take Jesus and wrap the body in, and is going to put him in a new tomb, a tomb that he had for his own use, evidently. We would garner from the other gospel accounts. Again, a bit of expense involved in this. He's personally invested in it. He's taking on the task himself. It's not delegated. He's not just going to be a silent partner in it. So we see some boldness, some interest, some real disciple-type action from Joseph. Even though we've never met him before, we're immediately impressed and find ourselves kind of wondering, is this the extent to which Peter and James and John and all of the others have really just vanished? that it's left to Joseph to come and do this. We don't know Joseph. We've never met Joseph before. Why is he showing up here now in the final hour to do all of this stuff? Well, because who else is going to? Everyone else seems to have departed. Everyone else really seems to have scattered to the winds. So when Joseph asks for the body, just briefly to mention an idea, and this, I don't know, these days you don't see a thought like this gain much traction. But for a while there was maybe a popular theory, and still is in some religious traditions, of Jesus not actually having died, of him, because he was not on the cross very long, and obviously because his body was not found in the tomb later on. Well, you can explain that with resurrection, but you can also explain that with just someone who wasn't dead, and they went and hid him for a while, and then they hid him somewhere else, or he fled the country, or I don't know, something else happened later, came back in a disguise. Pick your wacky ending to however that theory might go. But the fact for many people would be, there's no evidence that he was dead. Mark is painting up or packing up a pretty good case that's saying, no, he was definitely dead. You would have to have a lot of people who had misapprehensions if he were not. You have, first of all, as we already saw at the beginning, this centurion who is inches away, who is skilled in this kind of thing, presumably not his first rodeo. He has seen many people die. He's seen many people die in this exact way. He is a professional at this, and he is standing right there. He is standing opposite him in verse 39. That means facing him. He's looking right at him as Jesus breathes his last. He is certain that he's dead. Well, Pilate remarks on it in verses 43 and 44. In fact, he's a little bit surprised to hear, well, sometimes it takes longer than this, but we're sure he's dead, and he has that confirmed. We don't, we're Romans. We don't do anything like this poorly, so let's double check. And he confirms his death. Joseph then is going to be in immediate contact with the body. He's physically taking hold of it and is then going to go and bury it in a place where several people see it. And maybe it's important to remind ourselves then at this point, okay, well, maybe Joseph had an ulterior motive, and he's one of these kind of rabble-rouser type people, and so he'd forward a myth about Jesus being dead when he wasn't and try to start all of this resurrection stuff. That would be odd coming from a secret disciple, coming from someone who had a lot to lose by propagating a myth. He's a council member who is just all of a sudden now going to say, he didn't really raise from the dead, and he wasn't really dead when I took him, but I want to submarine my entire life by making up a lie about that. And I think I'll go ahead and go with that. It doesn't really fit his profile as we've seen him shown already. The language Mark uses in verses 43 and 45, he talks about it as being the body. He stops talking about Jesus as a person in that form for a little while. Yes, it wouldn't be inaccurate to say it's Jesus. We do the same thing when we are talking about one who has passed, but he's calling it the body. It's a corpse. It's not actually him anymore, or his spirit is no longer in it. It is simply the body that Mark is talking about. And of course, overarching all of that would be the fact that there's no record of anyone in history surviving a crucifixion. It's just not really something that happened. Again, the Romans were unfortunately very good at what they did. So not an idea that has any weight behind it whatsoever, and not the impression one could gather from any kind of honest reading of the Gospels. Just wanted to mention that briefly because of how many details Mark packs in here in these last several verses that confirm exactly what has happened. Jesus has been killed, and now they are going to bury him. So Joseph takes care of the task first, takes him to the tomb in verse 46. This would be, as probably most of us are familiar with, not similar to what we do. They would not go, I guess, vertically down into the ground using a coffin and those sorts of things. So this is a cave that's dug into a mountainside or a hillside. not a small thing. The prescription in some of the rabbinical writings is for a 6x9 little burial vault, a little cave that's going to be dug in, and you'd have kind of niches, little shelves almost, where a body might be put until it has decomposed suitably, and then the bones might be burned, or the fragments might be gathered into an ossuary, and you have then more room for that tomb to be reused. And so this is, again, as we see depicted elsewhere, evidently a new tomb that has just been cut out of the rock. And all of that's going to be sealed with this very large disc-shaped circular stone that can be rolled back and forth over the opening with effort because of its size. But that'll seal things over to keep wild animals from coming in and out, keep, I don't know, grave robbers. They probably wouldn't have anything useful that they would find in a tomb like that, but just going to keep everything not only away from the elements or away from any kind of scavenger types, but also there is a ceremonial aspect to it. The uncleanness of the dead body is then sort of kept within that place. So he is put in there, he is sealed in tight, and then we see in verse 47, getting back to the women that have been mentioned, they observed where he was laid. All right. One thing we have to ask, I guess, with some of what Mark has shown us with these women, is the purpose in all of this. And maybe verse 47 brings up a kind of related question. Why that language just does seem kind of strange or maybe extraneous to add there. Why mention that they saw where he was laid? Is there a purpose to telling us that aspect of things, that they saw where he was laid? Might serve a couple of roles, but just kind of think about it for a moment. Yeah, Doug?
I think it might be important to know that these were eyewitnesses that witnessed where he lay there. I'm guessing there was evidence where he lay, maybe blood or some of the stuff that they treated his body with. I mean, there had been evidence, and I think maybe it's important to say that there were eyewitnesses.
Okay. I do think that's the primary point in it, and it gets back to some of what we mentioned from verse 40 and a lot of what we're going to start seeing in chapter 16. That this isn't, I think that's where they took him, and, I went later and it was empty, and so, maybe he was raised. But we don't really know where he was taken to begin with. And so a lot of different things could have happened. I took my eye off the ball. And so there could be a few different explanations. No, these are women who have been looking on from afar, albeit, but they're looking on, they're watching, they're attentive to everything that's going on. They see where he's taken. They're going to go the next day and revisit the place, or a couple of days later. And they know where to go because they saw where he was put. But they've just been observing this entire thing the entire time. As Doug mentions, maybe you'd have other things around the tomb that would be identifying marks or something along those lines that would also help someone find it later, or would be able to point you in the right direction. But that does bring up, I guess, an interesting point in the gospel. And this is not a novel thought. You've probably discussed or considered this before. But for all of the gospel accounts to end in this way, or maybe for the proof of the resurrection to begin in this way in all of the gospel accounts, doesn't seem as strange to us in our day and time, but is a remarkable thing to be reading about for the first century reader, and is in fact something that was criticized by early skeptics and early opponents of Christianity, which is that it seems like a lot of your case is resting upon what a bunch of women told you. You get these women who get excitable and they believe in anything that you'll tell them, and you tell them this, and then they run with it, and that's what has happened to you guys. That was a common criticism for Christians in the first century. That so much of the gospel, that so much of the proof, so much of the eyewitness testimony was women who wouldn't be able to give testimony in court. People who you wouldn't believe if they said somebody stole a piece of bread, but I'm supposed to believe them that a man walked out of a tomb? That just doesn't stand up. Well, Mark is going to use that, and Matthew and Luke and John are going to use their testimony, because it's truthful. But it also helps us to understand, I guess, looking at things after the fact. If you are trying to convince someone of a lie, if you are trying to trick someone, trying to deceive someone, this is the worst possible way to go about it. Because for the people of that day and age, it is not effective. It is not useful to say, yes, that's what happened. These 3 women told me so. Why would I believe that then? Why would I accept that? But it is exactly what takes place. And it is good testimony because that's what they saw. These are honest women. They're going to tell us exactly what took place. Of course, it'll be verified later by everyone else. And that's what Paul will do in 1 Corinthians 15. If you don't want to take them for their word, all right, ask James, ask these 500 people, ask all the 12, ask everyone that you can come into contact with. Here are a bunch of references. But to begin the proof this way by saying, all right, Mary Magdalene is the first person you're going to want to hear this from, reflects the reality and in many ways reflects the beauty of this gospel account, that those who are least become the greatest, and those who you would anticipate maybe to be on the outside are those who are on the inside. And we've seen that kind of reversal happening all throughout Mark. It is a terrific honor that these women will be given there in chapter 16. Brother Ellis.
I find it interesting that Mark makes no mention of the guards.
Yeah, kind of.
Because they're the ones that were paid to refute what the women said.
Yeah, Matthew gives us a lot more information on that, the kind of conflicting stories that might have been circulating there in the immediate aftermath. Wilson?
Something that I have been trying to find, and I can't. Where did it say that they broke the legs of the people hanging on the cross because they weren't allowed to leave them there?
In John's account 19, verse 31, it looks like. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
I didn't
John's
get to
account.
John.
Yeah, well, he's the last one. Yeah, John 19, and Jesus kind of spared from that at the last moment, where they're coming to do that, and then they say, "Well, this one we don't need to. He's already dead." Yeah. Yeah, Karina. No.
That point that he brought up, this is, I don't think I've ever, Christ is killed, he's murdered. But it was miraculous in the way that he gave his spirit back to God, in my mind. Because in John, in the 19th chapter, in verse 30, he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit, meaning he had control. We don't have control over doing that.
And that, I mean, one of the common through lines that we've been seeing for a while, really this whole last week of Jesus' life, which is his control over what's going to happen. That it isn't, this doesn't happen to him. This is, to use the language of the book of Acts, it was appointed. It was what God planned. They are still responsible for what they've done, but they are acting ultimately in fulfillment of a plan that God has had because he is in control of the entire process. Yeah, Gary.
When you look at the architecture of the tomb, I think we get the understanding from verse 46 that Joseph went into the tomb, excuse me, with the Lord's body and laid it in the tomb and walked out. That place would suggest that that tomb wasn't all at large. Also, the rock that they rolled in there was circular on the bottom, says they rolled it. So they rolled that into that tomb, and it was of such a nature that not just anybody could roll it away. We already know that.
Yeah.
So if we could visualize this tomb, it was relatively small, and it was accommodated with a door on the front of it made out of rock.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting to know.
Yeah. And again, very different from our typical process, but something they would be, I guess, in line with some of the other things we've been pointing out. A person of those days would see the difficulty in trying to pull off a scam with everything that's involved, I guess. If you have a body that's put into a cave, a stone is rolled in front of it, the stone is sealed, as Matthew would tell us, and put under guard. And he's a man who has been scourged and has been on the cross for several hours to begin with. It's very difficult to make anything of that other than, a horror story if this is not actually someone who's going to be raised. Did other comments, questions? Annie, did you have your hand up?
I was wondering if this is the first test of faith, that we're to believe these women and...
Yes. Yeah. For the disciples, very much could be in line with that same idea of now they're going to, after the fact, get several chances to believe the unbelievable, to believe the unthinkable. And so, well, like Thomas, for instance, and all this, I know we're getting outside of Mark a little bit, but you'd have one like Thomas who hears a report and says, I don't know if I can accept it. I got to see myself. And Jesus responding to that by saying, good if you believe after you've seen it, but better to believe after you've just heard it. Better to believe even without seeing. And so it does raise that idea of maybe a test of faith with this testimony that's being offered here.
This is the first sign, but this is not the only. We're going to see another sign that they're going to have to follow too with the apostles.
Yeah.
In those 11, they're not going to be led astray.
Oh, sure.
There's going to be actions involved.
Yeah.
And an anointing, I guess. What makes this event happen?
Yeah, this is not the end of proof. This is not the end of...
It's not the end of the proof.
Yeah. No, really only the beginning in that sense. Wilson.
When we think of the tomb was not a dirt deal. It was carved out of rock.
Yeah.
And it was something that not everybody had.
No.
It had to be somebody that was rather affluent to afford to have something like that.
Yeah.
So that's why that was the greatest. If you're going to bury Christ, put him in something that's affluent and big.
Yeah.
And
And to that point, his is borrowed. He cannot afford his own, yes.
That's right, he couldn't afford it, but Joseph did,
Yeah.
and he was willing to give it up.
Yeah,
And
yeah, speaks
And like you
speaks
said-
well of him here at the end.
like you said before, they used those tombs over and over.
Mhm.
Once the body had deteriorated and they got rid of the bones and everything, the next person that died could be put right in there too.
Yep. All right, we run out of time. We'll get to what the women do when they go to try to see Jesus next week. We'll have to look at that. As always, appreciate your comments, appreciate your attention this morning. Next week, we'll start in around verse 47, maybe mention a few other things about the burial itself, but Mark 15:47, right on the cusp of chapter 16. We'll start there next week. Thanks a lot for your time.